despite new GPUs coming out soon, it's going to be the high end. So if you're still thinking, I really just want 1080p gaming, maybe 60 FPS at reasonable settings in the latest games and higher refresh rates than that in esports titles, there's not really that big of a reason why you'd still want to wait if you want to get something now. We're not going to see huge price drops for quite a while, I think, on this lower end. Now, that being said, if you're willing to go AMD, I think the RX 6600 is going to be the best possible choice. Now, if you're comparing it to Nvidia, there's a couple of options. You could look at the RTX 2060 or the RTX 3050. And let me actually get into some of the current pricing and performance, and then we'll get into some head-to-head benchmarks. We'll look at things like DLSS, we'll look at ray tracing performance, we'll look at 1080p, 1440p, all sorts of different games, all of that. But first, I want to make sure you see why I'm targeting the GPUs that I am at in this video. So here's the thing. If you wanted to buy an RTX 3060 right now, your price is all the way up around $385 for a tiny little single fan model, and around $390 if you want one of the lowest priced dual fan models. For a lot of people, that's just out of your price range. If you want to go down to an RTX 3050, you're still paying around $300 for the absolute cheapest available new model. Whereas if you look at the RX 6600 from AMD, current pricing, now I'll admit this $259.99 pricing does involve relying on a, well, actually I thought it involved on relying on a mail-in rebate. Apparently this one does not. So looks like you got $260 along with a couple of free games in this Raise the Game bundle. That looks like a heck of a good deal compared to something like the RTX 3050, which costs significantly more and performs less, right? So if we look at the RX 6600, if you look at the RTX 3050, its performance relatively on average is significantly lower, right? But if you look at the RTX 2060 from Nvidia, which is, I think, the only 20 series card that they're actually still producing and you can buy new, the performance gap is a lot closer here. But does this, relative performance, what does that mean in terms of graphic settings? We'll dive into those head-to-head benchmarks. But I want to make sure you understand why I'm comparing these particular GPUs. If we look at the RTX 2060, in terms of new pricing right now, it's extremely close to our RX 6600. A single fan model is available at $250, whereas if you're willing to spend $270, we start to see dual fan coolers. And so the pricing right now between the RTX 2060 and RX 6600 is very competitive. Now, when we get into the actual feature sets of these cards, the difference between AMD and Nvidia and all that, you do have to think about things like DLSS versus FSR in terms of upscaling a game from a lower resolution to improve its performance. You could think of things like ray tracing. Is it even worth considering on GPUs of this caliber? And if it is, what is their performance? We'll look at all of this in this video. Now, the specific models that I'm testing out, just so you're aware, are my RTX 2060. I actually managed to get a used one for $200, and it was this RTX 2060 6GB dual Evo OC. So this model does have a small factory OC. I don't think that's going to be heavily weighting the performance here, but do realize that I use out-of-the-box settings on my GPUs. And the GPU that I'm testing for AMD here is the Speedster Swift 210, which is also a decent little two-fan cooler here. And these are available for about $290 new right now. But again, the performance between different cooler models and all of that is relatively small, a couple percent, not very noticeable here generally. Now, let's go ahead and jump into the side-by-side benchmarks, and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. All right, we'll start our head-to-head benchmarking with Red Dead Redemption 2. Game's a few years old, but still pretty demanding at its maximum settings, and that's what we're using here. We're taking the favor quality slider all the way to the right in the graphics settings menu and going with that. Now, in this kind of easier to run interior scene, it is looking like the 2060 delivers 60 FPS, but as we step outside and get into more demanding areas of the game, you would either have to live with less than 60 FPS, which on a variable refresh rate screen could be fine, or you need to turn down a bit of settings, whereas the 6600 has a much easier time maintaining 60 FPS or above at the maximum settings. Also notice the power draw difference with the older, more power-hungry 2060, drawing a lot more energy than the more efficient 6600. Now here we're looking at more optimized settings. I decided to use the Hardware Unboxed optimized settings. So if you check out the Hardware Unboxed YouTube channel, when this game came out, they did a series of 2 videos where they found some incredible performance gains with some minor hits to visual quality. And you can see that both of these GPUs can deliver a good high refresh rate experience with these optimized settings, although the 6600 is certainly still well ahead here. And in fact, percentage-wise, it actually seems like it might be a little further ahead at the optimized settings than it was at the lower settings, at least in some scenes. Depending on the scene you're looking at here, sometimes the GPUs are a little closer together, sometimes a little further away. Now, buying either of these for 1440p would not be ideal, but we will be testing some 1440p results, because I get it. Sometimes you got a 1440p screen, you're on a bit of a budget for the GPU choice. So here we actually see once again that the 6600 does have a lead at 1440p, even though a lot of times, you know, the AMD architecture is known for falling a little bit behind at 1440p compared to 1080p. We are certainly still seeing a lead here, and again, you're seeing the max settings versus the optimized settings. Now, Cyberpunk is still one of the most demanding games out there. A lot of people just accuse it as being unoptimized. Well, the ultra settings are certainly very difficult to run. The high settings are a bit more reasonable, and we can see here that the 6600 is giving playable ultra setting frame rates, but I think high settings make a lot more sense. And we can see that in these difficult interior scenes, the 2060, even going down to the high settings, has a lot more dips below 60 FPS, whereas the 6600 actually most of the time stays above 60 FPS, and a lot of the times, like we're seeing here, can even go up into the upper 70s, lower 80 FPS range, and give a very smooth experience overall at the high setting. Now, both GPUs are giving you a reasonable experience here, and obviously there's more detailed tweaking you could do to the settings and all of that. I'll also note that I think at the ultra settings we could be seeing a bit of a VRAM hit here too. Cyberpunk can use quite a bit of VRAM. Now, here we're looking at what if we went all the way down to medium settings, and that'll help the 2060 stay above 60 FPS even in these more demanding bar scenes, although we still see a few little dips. And I'm also looking at what if we stayed at the high settings but used DLSS quality, which doesn't look great at 1080p, but a lot of people will be less sensitive to the little bits of ghosting and aliasing you'll see in motion with the DLSS image at 1080p. It's a lot more effective at higher resolutions. But once again, we're seeing the 6600 at the medium settings pulling well ahead of the 2060. And this is also showing you that when people say the RX 6600 is a 1080p 60 FPS card, they're talking when you're using a mix of high and ultra settings. Even in a game like Cyberpunk, if you're willing to go down to medium settings, you can get a very high refresh rate experience on that on the RX 6600, and again, even the high settings are doing a very good job here. So this is showing that, again, both GPUs can give you good 1080p performance, but the 6600 seems well ahead to me. At 1440p, you know, going down to the medium settings, the 6600 is pretty playable, but you're definitely dipping into the 50s and occasionally into the 40s at times. The 2060, again, playable depending on your definition of playable, but using DLSS at 1440p actually looks pretty good. I think a lot of people would be willing to take that trade-off going to DLSS quality. And we can see that compared against FSR 1.0, not 2.0. We'll look at that later when we look at God of War. But FSR 1.0 ultra quality, I do not think looks as good as DLSS quality. It could be usable, especially depending on your tolerance of a little bit of smudge to some details. But DLSS's temporal data certainly helps it reconstruct the fine details of the image a lot better than that FSR image does. Although do notice that performance-wise, the 6600 is using the high settings with FSR 1.0 ultra quality, whereas the 2060 is needing to go down to medium settings and kicking in DLSS to get pretty similar performance. Now, what about ray tracing? Well, remember that While the AMD GPUs are well behind NVIDIA in terms of ray tracing performance, that's mostly comparing the current generation. The ray tracing performance in the 20 series isn't too far ahead, or is it even ahead here when we look at it, of AMD's 6000 series. I was actually expecting to see the 2060 pull ahead here, but all I can do is show you my results, which is at RT low, which admittedly is just interior shadows. The 6600 does seem to be slightly outperforming the 2060. Now, whether that's truly just its ray tracing performance or could be the 2060, using ray tracing does increase the VRAM usage. So it could be slowing down due to VRAM limitations, but for whatever reason, the 6600 does seem to be ahead here, although using DLSS quality does look better than FSR 1.0 Ultra quality. Honestly, I would not turn on FSR just to get ray tracing here. I don't think it's worth it. The performance lead even expands when we're using upscaling here. Now, I was curious if it was just going to be the case with the ray tracing at the low settings, which is just like interior local shadows. I was curious if using reflections would show a different result here. And it's actually, once again, looking like they're pretty close in performance, although I do think that NVIDIA does seem to maybe handle the reflections a little bit better here. But scene to scene, we can see either card taking a small lead at the native settings. With DLSS, again, I think the image looks a lot more usable than the FSR 1.0 image does. And YouTube compression is going to remove a lot of the details there, so you really have to see it in person. The FSR 1.0 certainly doesn't upscale as well at 1080p as DLSS quality does. But to be honest, again here, I'd really say that the overall ray tracing performance, at least in Cyberpunk, just isn't worth using on either GPU. When you see the image quality that you gain from the ray tracing, I don't think it's made up for by the low frame rates and possible upscaling hit to performance that you'd have to take. So I decided to take a look at another game that has much easier ray tracing. RT High is actually the lowest ray trace settings in Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy here. Also notice the choppiness of the recording on the RX 6600 here. It looked much smoother than that on the actual screen. Occasionally in this game, and as well as in God of War, the recording came out choppy. I even went back and re-recorded it. I even updated to a newer driver partway through filming these, and it didn't smooth out the recording there. But we definitely see the RTX 2060 performing better here. And even if you look at the frame time graph, which is a better judge of the smoothness than the actual footage, the frame time graph is a lot smoother on the 2060. Now, I was curious if that just meant that NVIDIA just performs better in this game overall, regardless of if it's ray tracing or not. And actually, that does seem to be the case. This is a game where the RTX 2060 is actually outperforming the RX 6600, even without the ray tracing on. Whereas we saw in the other games we've looked at so far, the RX 6600 usually has a pretty healthy lead. So the fact that the 2060 swings into the lead here means that this game is very favorable to the NVIDIA GPU. Also here, notice the 1080p Ultra footage, again, looks kind of choppier than it did in person on the screen, whereas the 1440p seemed to record smoothly. So there seems to be some issue with the 1080p footage in this game for some reason on my AMD GPU. Now, since we just looked at a game that seemed to be out of character with how NVIDIA preferential it was, I'll show you a situation where it's a just absolutely dominating performance for AMD, which is Forza Horizon 5, especially when you can use resizable bar. I guess I should call it smart access memory. Now, NVIDIA doesn't offer resizable bar support on its 2000 series GPUs, and it doesn't even enable it in this game anyway, even on the 3000 series. So do note that I do have smart access memory enabled for my testing here. And so that is, something the RX 6600 can take advantage of that the RTX 2060 can't. So I think it's fair to do that. But do be aware that if you were on a platform that didn't support smart access memory, you would maybe not be seeing this outsized performance lead in Forza Horizon 5, at least not quite quite as dramatically as we see here. In most games, the performance gained from smart access memory on the RX 6600 is fairly low, just usually single-digit percentages, but Forza Horizon 5 is a bit of an outlier. Now, let's look at God of War. This is another one of the games where the footage at 1080p wasn't recording very smoothly on my RX 6600. Again, I tried it on a couple of different drivers, and restarting the PC, all of that, and it still just came out a bit choppy in this game for whatever reason. Now, I'll note that also, in fairness, the 2060 didn't didn't look right when I was actually running the game when I recorded this one. This is a bit off topic, but when it was, I resized it to a 1080p window and on the actual display, and it didn't really like that. But the real reason I wanted to look at this was DLSS quality versus FSR 2.0 quality and the overall image quality you get here. Because FSR 2.0 looks a lot better than 1.0 does, especially at a low resolution like 1080p, but I do still think DLSS looks better here. Especially look at the details on the beard, especially as a breath of foggy air gets blown out. I think we see a lot of more aliasing issues on the FSR 2.0 image than we get on the DLSS image here. And again, sorry for the choppiness of the footage here, but that's something you can take into this review. I'm recording each of these using its own driver software, and you are seeing the image quality that we get. At 1440p, again, it recorded more smoothly, so I'm not quite sure, again, what's the underlying cause of that issue. But when we look at the overall performance here, we're certainly seeing the RX 6600 once again ahead. Now, it's also interesting to note that DX11 titles used to be a bit of a weak spot for AMD, but recently they did some driver updates to their DX11 performance, and I think that is helping. They've also, even more recently, updated their OpenGL performance, which none of the because I use relatively modern and demanding games in my testing here, so I don't use any OpenGL titles. But games like Minecraft, things like that, recently got a big performance boost for AMD as well. Now, in this scene, you're kind of seeing the difference in the shadows between the original settings and the ultra settings, and him standing here. This is more similar to the actual gameplay performance you'd get. Let's go ahead and look at Horizon Zero Dawn, and we're looking at the 1080p Ultra and 1440p Ultra settings. And in this game, we are definitely seeing, once again, a big lead for the RX 6600. So it's not like the 2060 can't handle this game. At 1080p Ultra settings, it's delivering a very good experience, no problem maxing it out at 1080p, and it's even pretty playable at 1440p Ultra, although you'd probably at that setting want to turn things down a bit. Now, I'll also take this chance to mention, again, it's not like I never have issues with my Nvidia GPUs. If you look at the text, especially at the 1440p Ultra RTX 2060 footage there, I felt like the text looked a little bit less crisp than it could. And then here at the end, we're looking at the Horizon Zero Dawn at 4K. And I wanted to show you in this game, when you run out of VRAM, you definitely get some issues. So that's what we're seeing here, is some VRAM problems here. And I just realized that I accidentally left my RTX 3050 title on this portion of the screen. So realize that is a typo. This is an RX 6600, but I grabbed this footage from a previous comparison video and I swapped in my AMD GPU footage, but it looks like I forgot to edit out the title. So apologies for that. Now, looking at a game where we don't get visual artifacts from running out of VRAM, I thought I'd look at 4K performance, not because that's a realistic thing that you'd want to be doing on either of these GPUs, but this is a good chance to look at what if we're using our upscaling at a pretty aggressive rate. So we're looking at DLSS performance down at the medium settings on the 2060. I was curious if we went that aggressively at upscaling. DLSS is upscaling from 1080p, I believe, at this resolution. Could we get like a 60 FPS experience? And the answer is no. Whereas the RX 6600, using FSR 1.0 at the balance settings, we are able to get closer to a 60 FPS, although not that it never drops below there kind of experience here. Although the differences between these two upscales are kind of interesting because the FSR 1.0 at balance is working with a higher native resolution, but it doesn't have that temporal data. So, there's pros and cons of each image, although I think the DLSS image does look a bit preferable here on this upscale. Let's pop out for some final thoughts. So overall, I think we saw that the only performance advantage we saw for the RTX 2060 was in Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Now that's in the set of games that I tested here, but overall it looks like in most cases you will have similar performance with the 6600 a bit ahead, or in some cases a significant win for the 6600. And that seemed to be across the board at 1080p, where you would primarily be playing with these GPUs, and if you're trying to stretch them into 1440p, the RX 6600 did seem to still have a lead there, despite AMD's performance dropping off a little bit at 1440p on this RDNA 2 architecture. Now, so overall, when it comes to the main differences between the cards, is there any reason why you'd want to go with the Nvidia card if they cost about the same, but the 6600 generally delivers better performance? Well, the main differences are DLSS versus FSR. DLSS has wider support, especially against the FSR 2.0 version, and it does look a little bit better, especially against the FSR 1.0, but even still a little bit better than the FSR 2.0, as we saw in the God of War comparison. So DLSS is a reason why you might want to consider that, although, DLSS's main job is to get you some performance at a small cost to image quality. And if the AMD card already has better performance, then DLSS, might get you a lead, but maybe not a huge lead over the native performance maybe of the 6600. So, DLSS is definitely an advantage for Nvidia, but personally between the two, that's not going to sway me here. And when their primary target is 1080p, I don't think I'd be trying to use a lot of upscaling, and a lot of times I just turn down to high or medium settings if I needed to. And the RX 6600 was delivering such good performance at high settings or ultra settings in all the games we tested, I don't think you'd be needing to do a lot of turning down of the settings. Now, another place where Nvidia typically has an advantage is ray tracing performance. Now, I've got to admit the ray tracing performance can be very different in different games, but my overall conclusion was in most games, the performance hit is not at all worth it, and in a lot of games, you can't even get a 60 FPS experience with much, if any, ray tracing turned on at all on either GPU. And actually, I was expecting to see a larger lead in ray tracing performance for the Nvidia card than what we saw here. And I think that's because we're looking at the 20 series ray tracing performance, which was not as advanced as the 3000 series. So overall, personally, I wouldn't be using ray tracing on either of these GPUs. They're not strong enough at it, and you're taking too big of a frame rate hit in order to utilize it. So I really wouldn't, we didn't see much of a ray tracing performance advantage, if any, and the overall performance was bad enough on both of them that I just wouldn't use it. So that wouldn't sway me. So what would sway you? Well, as we saw here, there was a few little recording issues that could be more symptomatic or representative of people do feel like there are more issues with AMD drivers. Now, I think that that's true. There are more issues with AMD drivers than there are with NVIDIA drivers, although there are definitely issues with NVIDIA drivers. They aren't perfect. I don't think, at least in my personal experience, and I did use an RX 6800 XT from AMD as my main GPU for 6 months recently, and it did occasionally have, a little bit of sometimes the game would crash, and it doesn't crash as often on NVIDIA, things like that. And then like we saw here, a little bit of some recording hiccups on the AMD GPU that I wasn't experienced as much of on the NVIDIA GPU, that kind of thing. So I do think you are getting a slightly smoother experience, out-of-the-box experience on average with an NVIDIA GPU, although there are lots of people who report never having a single problem with their AMD GPU and the drivers. So a lot of times, driver issues can be very particular to your exact set of hardware and games that you play, so it's hard to put an exact value on that. Where I think you can put more of an exact value on things is with certain professional applications, productivity applications that are geared towards NVIDIA. They're programmed for the CUDA core support. AMD support isn't really as as available, just with how the hardware is programmed. So if you use any particular professional applications, if there's professional use cases for your GPU, you need to look very carefully at if there is good AMD support for that, because that's definitely a case where you might want to go the Nvidia route. Whereas if it's just straight up for gaming here, I've got to say I would definitely take the RX 6600 over the RTX 2060. Now, if you're like, are these really that much better than the RTX 3050? That one does cost more. I mean, I've compared each of these against the 3050 in other videos. And yes, these are both a lot better than the 3050. The 3050 has to be, given the prices it's actually been selling for, like the worst buy in the GPU market. It just makes absolutely no sense, even against its previous gen Nvidia competitor with the RTX 2060. All right, hopefully this was useful, you guys, and I hope you have an excellent day.